If you were a professional in the early 2000s, there was one small object that quietly controlled your day. A phone with a tiny screen, a physical keyboard, and a blinking red light that meant something important had arrived. An email, a deal, a message that couldn't wait. For millions of people around the world, that device was more than just a phone. It was an office in your pocket. This was BlackBerry, the device trusted by presidents, CEOs, bankers, and governments. At its peak, it controlled nearly half the smartphone market in North America. But then something happened. A single product launch changed the entire industry. Within just a few years, the company that once defined smartphones was fighting to survive. This is the story of how BlackBerry rose from a small Canadian startup to rule the world, and how it lost everything. To understand BlackBerry, you first have to understand the personality of the man who created it. In the 1960s, in the quiet Canadian city of Windsor, a boy named Mike Lazaridis spent most of his childhood surrounded by electronics. While other children were playing sports or riding bicycles, Lazaridis was doing something very different. He was taking radios apart. Not because they were broken, but because he wanted to understand how they worked. His parents soon realized something unusual about their son. He was deeply curious about technology. By the time he reached high school, he had already read almost every science and engineering book available in his local library. In fact, one famous story, often repeated in interviews, describes how Lazaridis once won a school science prize simply for reading so many technical books about electricity. But what fascinated him most was not just machines. It was communication, the invisible signals that travel through the air. The idea that information could move instantly from one place to another. That idea captured his imagination, and eventually, it would shape the future of mobile communication. In 1984, at just 23 years old, Lazaridis made a decision that surprised many people around him. Instead of finishing his final year at the University of Waterloo, he dropped out. Not because he lacked interest in education, but because he believed he had something more important to build. Together with his close friend Douglas Fregin, he started a small technology company. They called it Research in Motion. At the beginning, the company was small, very small. The office was modest, money was limited, and success was far from guaranteed. But Lazaridis had a powerful belief about the future. He believed that one day, people would not need to sit in front of computers to communicate. Instead, communication would travel with them. In their pockets, in their hands, wherever they went. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Research in Motion quietly focused on developing wireless data technology. The work was complicated, often experimental, and sometimes difficult for outsiders to understand. But inside the company, a very clear vision was forming. A world where messages could travel instantly, without wires. Then, in 1999, the company introduced a device that would completely change business communication. A small, handheld machine, designed for one specific purpose: mobile email. At first glance, the device looked simple: a tiny screen, a compact keyboard, minimal design. But what it allowed people to do felt revolutionary. For the first time, professionals could send and receive emails instantly, from anywhere. Deals could be negotiated while traveling. Messages could be answered from taxis, airports, and conference rooms, and that convenience quickly became addictive. Soon, journalists started using a nickname for the device. They called it Crackberry, because once people started using it, they simply could not stop checking it. By the early 2000s, BlackBerry had become the most trusted communication device in the business world. Investment bankers on Wall Street depended on it. Corporate executives carried it everywhere. And even the President of the United States, Barack Obama, famously insisted on keeping his BlackBerry after entering the White House. The device had something competitors struggled to match: speed, security, reliability, and perhaps most importantly, that famous physical keyboard. Typing emails on a BlackBerry felt natural, fast, precise. For professionals who sent dozens of messages every day, it was the perfect tool. By the mid-2000s, BlackBerry had achieved something extraordinary. It had become the most powerful smartphone brand in North America. Millions of people carried one. Executives believed they had built the future. But thousands of miles away, in California, another company was preparing a device that would challenge everything BlackBerry believed about phones. And when that device finally appeared, the entire industry would change. On January 9th, 2007, a crowd gathered inside a large auditorium in San Francisco. The event was hosted by Apple. On stage stood a man known for dramatic product launches, Steve Jobs. The audience expected a new phone, but what Jobs revealed felt different. He pulled a sleek device from his pocket. No keyboard, no buttons, just a large glass screen. And then he said something that would become famous. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. The device was called the Apple iPhone. At first glance, the iPhone looked almost strange. Where BlackBerry had a keyboard, the iPhone had none. Where BlackBerry focused on email, the iPhone focused on a touchscreen experience. Users could scroll through photos with their fingers, zoom into web pages, watch videos, listen to music, browse the internet like they would on a computer. For many people watching the launch, it felt revolutionary. But inside BlackBerry headquarters in Canada, the reaction was surprisingly calm. Executives examined the device carefully. Engineers studied the touchscreen keyboard, and many of them reached the same conclusion. The iPhone was impressive, but it had problems. Typing on glass felt slower than typing on real keys. The battery life seemed limited. And most importantly, the iPhone lacked the secure corporate email system that BlackBerry had perfected. To them, the device looked like a consumer gadget, something fun for entertainment, but not something serious business professionals would rely on. So the leadership at Research in Motion continued doing what had always worked. They focused on improving email, improving keyboards, improving security. But something subtle was happening in the market. Consumers were starting to use their phones differently. Phones were no longer just tools for communication. They were becoming digital lifestyle devices. People wanted photos, videos, navigation, music, games. And soon, something even more powerful appeared: mobile applications. Developers began building apps that could run directly on smartphones: social media, maps, ride-sharing, messaging platforms. And companies like Google quickly introduced the Android operating system to compete with Apple. Suddenly, the smartphone industry was moving at incredible speed. Touchscreens became larger. Apps became more powerful. Phones became entertainment centers, communication tools, and computers all at once. BlackBerry tried to respond. They released touchscreen devices. They redesigned their software. They experimented with hybrid models, combining keyboards with larger displays. But the company had a difficult problem. Its entire system had been built around email. Meanwhile, Apple and Android were building entire ecosystems. Developers preferred platforms where millions of users could download apps. Consumers preferred phones where they could install new features instantly. And slowly, almost quietly, BlackBerry's dominance began to fade. By 2010, competitors were selling more touchscreen smartphones than ever before. By 2011, BlackBerry's market share started collapsing. Year after year, more customers switched to iPhones and Android devices. Developers stopped building apps for BlackBerry. Retailers reduced shelf space. And investors began to worry. For the first time in its history, the company that once defined the smartphone industry was struggling to keep up. Inside the company, engineers worked hard to redesign the operating system, but momentum had already shifted. In technology, timing is everything, and BlackBerry had reacted too late. Finally, in 2016, the company made a decision that would have once seemed impossible. BlackBerry stopped designing its own smartphones. The iconic devices with physical keyboards, the blinking red notification light, the tools that once powered boardrooms and governments, disappeared from the market. The company eventually reinvented itself as a cybersecurity and enterprise software firm. Today, BlackBerry still exists, but the phones that once ruled the world are now part of technology history. And the story leaves behind an important lesson. BlackBerry did not collapse because its engineers lacked talent. It collapsed because it believed the future would always look like the past. In the world of technology, dominance can disappear faster than anyone expects. And sometimes, the most dangerous moment for a successful company is the moment it believes it cannot fail.